The developer spent nearly $6 million building 40 luxury vacation cabins around my lake, booked guests months before opening day, printed glossy brochures promising peaceful mornings on the water, and convinced investors he had found the perfect hidden getaway in the mountains. Then one old document my grandfather filed decades ago brought the entire project to a standstill. The craziest part is that the developer didn't even know I existed until his grand opening was already falling apart. Looking back now, I still remember the moment I realized what was happening, and honestly, if someone else told me this story, I'd probably think they were exaggerating. My name is Ethan Mercer, and for most of my life, Mercer Lake was the kind of place nobody paid attention to. It sat about 20 miles outside a small town called Pine Hollow, tucked inside a shallow valley surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills. There were no resorts, no tour boats, no fancy restaurants. Just clean water, quiet mornings, and enough peace to make the rest of the world feel far away. My grandfather bought the property back in the 70s when land out there was cheap and nobody saw much value in it. He wasn't rich. He worked hard, saved what he could, and bought the land because he loved fishing and hated crowds. According to family stories, most people thought he'd wasted his money. Years later, those same people wished they had done the same thing. Growing up, I spent almost every summer at the lake. I learned how to fish there. I learned how to repair fences there. I learned how to sit quietly and listen to nature without feeling the need to fill every second with noise. My grandfather used to sit on the dock drinking coffee before sunrise, staring across the water like he was reading a book only he could see. Sometimes I'd sit beside him and ask what he was thinking about. He'd smile and say, "Most people only notice what's on the surface, Ethan. The important stuff is usually underneath." At 10 years old, I thought he was talking about fish. It took me decades to understand what he really meant. After Grandpa passed away, the property eventually came to me. Life moved on. The lake stayed the same. The seasons came and went. Every year the water froze in winter and sparkled in summer. It felt permanent, like one of those rare places the modern world forgot existed. Then everything changed. One spring morning, I noticed bright orange survey flags across the southern shoreline. At first I ignored them. People survey land all the time. A few weeks later, I heard bulldozers, then excavators, then dump trucks. Every day the noise got louder. Trees started disappearing from the hillsides. Gravel roads appeared where forests had been. One afternoon I drove around the lake to see what was going on, and that's when I saw the sign. Cedar Ridge Lakeside Retreat, coming soon. I remember laughing out loud, not because it was funny, but because the sign looked ridiculously expensive. The kind of sign companies build when they're absolutely convinced they're about to make a fortune. At first I figured somebody was building a handful of cabins. Maybe 5, maybe 6. Nothing worth worrying about. Then I ran into my friend Travis at a diner in town. Travis had spent 20 years working construction and knew everyone's business before they did. He sat down across from me, took a sip of coffee, and said, "You hear how big that project's getting?" I shrugged. "Couple cabins, right?" Travis laughed so hard, he nearly spilled his drink. "Couple? They're building 40. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. 40 cabins. A main lodge. Walking trails. Fire pits. Boat docks. Kayak rentals. The whole thing. I drove out there again the following weekend and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Entire rows of cabins overlooked the water. Every deck faced the lake. Every path led toward the shoreline. Every advertisement featured the view. Over the next few months, the marketing campaign exploded. Social media videos showed couples drinking coffee beside the water at sunrise. Families paddled kayaks across the lake. Professional drone footage captured the reflection of the mountains in the water. One slogan appeared everywhere: "Experience untouched nature at Mercer Lake." That phrase made me laugh every single time. Untouched nature. Meanwhile, they had spent months tearing up half a hillside with heavy equipment. Still, I wasn't angry. They owned their land. They had the right to build on it. That's how property works. What bothered me was something else. Nobody had ever contacted me. Not once. No introduction. No courtesy call. No discussion. Nothing. It felt strange because the entire project revolved around the lake. Without the lake, those cabins were just expensive boxes in the woods. Then one afternoon, while walking near the eastern edge of my property after a storm, I noticed a construction crew working near a narrow stream. Most people wouldn't have thought twice about it. The stream wasn't impressive. You could step over it without getting your shoes wet. But I knew exactly what it was. That stream carried water directly from the natural spring on my property into Mercer Lake. I stopped walking and watched from a distance. Several workers were taking measurements. One man pointed toward the lake while another studied a set of plans. Then I noticed stacks of pipe lying nearby. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they had permits. Maybe I was overthinking things. But something felt off. That night I sat at my kitchen table and started searching through county records. One document led to another. Construction permits, property filings, environmental reports. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Then I found something I hadn't looked at in years. An old property document filed by my grandfather decades earlier. I read it once, then twice, then a third time. By the time I finished, I was staring at the screen in complete silence. Because if that document still carried legal weight, the developer had just built a multi-million-dollar resort around a lake he might not actually have the right to use. And the next morning, I decided to find out whether my grandfather's forgotten paperwork was about to become someone's very expensive problem. The next morning I drove straight into town carrying a folder I hadn't opened in years. It contained old surveys, property maps, deeds, and handwritten notes my grandfather had kept long before computers stored everything. Honestly, I wasn't expecting much. Documents get outdated. Laws change. Rights expire. I figured there was a decent chance I'd spend a few hours chasing a dead end and come home with nothing. But something about the way those workers had been standing near the stream kept bothering me. It felt too deliberate, too specific, like they knew that little waterway mattered, even if they didn't fully understand why. My first stop was the county records office. The woman behind the counter, Margaret, had worked there longer than almost anyone in town. She knew my grandfather and remembered my father. When I showed her the documents, she adjusted her glasses and said, "Well, I haven't seen one of these in a while." That wasn't exactly reassuring. I asked her what she meant. She pointed to a section buried in the original filing and said, "Most people only pay attention to land ownership. Your grandfather recorded water rights separately." I felt my heartbeat pick up. Separately how? She looked back at the screen. The spring source feeding Mercer Lake was legally attached to your property title. Commercial use requires authorization from the rights holder. I stared at her. "You mean me?" She nodded. Assuming everything is still valid, yes. I left the office with more questions than answers. That's when I called an attorney named Rachel Donovan. Rachel specialized in property and water rights disputes, and after hearing a brief summary over the phone, she told me to bring every document I had. 2 days later, I was sitting across from her conference table while she reviewed the files. She spent nearly an hour reading without saying much. Every now and then she'd underline something or make a note. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was the kind of smile a poker player gives when they realize they're holding a stronger hand than everyone else at the table. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "when was the last time someone reviewed these records?" "Probably decades ago." She nodded slowly. "That explains a lot. Is that good news?" I asked. "For you," she said. "Potentially very good news." Then she explained what nobody had bothered to tell the developer. The lake wasn't simply a naturally occurring body of water from a legal perspective. The primary source maintaining its water level was the spring located entirely on my property. According to the original filings, any commercial operation relying on that water source required permission from the rights holder. Nobody had requested permission. Nobody had negotiated an agreement. Nobody had even contacted me. For a few seconds I just sat there processing everything. "So what happens now?" I asked. Rachel folded her hands. "That depends on what you want." It was a fair question. The truth is, I didn't hate the resort. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone's investment. I wasn't some bitter neighbor looking for revenge. What bothered me was the arrogance. Somebody had built an entire business around a resource connected to my property and never once thought it might be worth having a conversation. I told Rachel exactly that. She nodded. "Then let's start by seeing how they respond when they're reminded the law exists." Over the next week, she dug deeper into the records while I kept watching construction. The resort was almost finished. Landscaping crews planted decorative trees. Workers installed signs directing guests toward walking trails. A wooden dock stretched into the water. Kayak racks appeared near the shoreline. Every day the place looked closer to opening. Everyday investors probably felt more confident. Everyday guests booked reservations. And every day nobody from the development company contacted me. Then came the advertisement that changed everything. One evening I saw a video online promoting the grand opening weekend. A drone flew over the lake, while cheerful music played in the background. Families paddled kayaks. Couples sat beside the shore. Children splashed in the water. The narrator called Mercer Lake the heart of the entire retreat experience. I watched the video twice. Then I forwarded it to Rachel. 10 minutes later my phone rang. "Well," she said, "they just made our case easier." A week before the official grand opening, Rachel filed a formal notice with the county. The filing wasn't dramatic. There were no threats, no lawsuits, no emotional accusations, just documents. Lots of documents. Survey maps, historical filings, water rights records, legal descriptions connecting the spring to my property. The notice explained that the lake's primary water source was privately controlled and that any commercial use required authorization from the rights holder. In simple terms, the resort had built its entire marketing strategy around something it hadn't legally secured. The county responded much faster than I expected. Apparently, when millions of dollars in potential liability are involved, paperwork moves surprisingly quickly. Within days, inspectors began reviewing records. Surveyors revisited old maps. Attorneys examined filings nobody had looked at for years. Then one afternoon, Rachel called with the update we've been waiting for. They confirmed the documents. I nearly dropped the phone. Confirmed. Every major point. What does that mean? There was a pause. It means your developer friend has a problem. The compliance order arrived shortly afterward. Until the water rights issue was resolved, the resort could not advertise lake access as part of its commercial offering. It could not modify the inlet stream. It could not offer certain water-based activities. It could not represent unrestricted use of the lake to paying guests. Legally speaking, the county had just pulled the centerpiece out of their marketing campaign. News spread fast. Pine Hollow was a small town. By the end of the week, everyone seemed to know something was happening. People discussed it at gas stations, diners, hardware stores, and church parking lots. Some thought I was being unfair. Others thought the developer deserved it. Most just enjoyed the drama. Then came my favorite moment. A local business reporter published an article about the resort's delayed opening. The article never mentioned me by name, but it described an unresolved water rights dispute affecting operations. That was the first public sign that the project was in trouble. And suddenly the confident marketing machine that had dominated social media for months went strangely quiet. No new advertisements. No opening countdowns. No promotional videos. Just silence. Then one Friday afternoon my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I answered. "Mr. Mercer?" a man asked. "Speaking." There was a brief pause. "My name is Blake Harrington." I recognized the name immediately. Blake Harrington was the developer behind Cedar Ridge Retreat. We had never spoken before. Not once. Yet somehow I already knew this conversation would be very different from the confidence he'd been showing the world all year. His voice was polite, careful, controlled. The kind of voice people use when they're trying very hard not to sound worried. "I'd like to discuss a mutually beneficial solution," he said. I looked out across the lake through my kitchen window. The water was calm. The sunset reflected across the surface. For the first time since this entire situation started, I smiled. Because after spending millions of dollars and building 40 cabins, Blake Harrington had finally discovered something my grandfather understood decades earlier. The most important part of the lake wasn't the view everyone could see. It was the source nobody bothered to notice. I looked out across the lake for a few seconds before answering. Part of me wanted to enjoy the moment a little longer. For nearly a year, Blake Harrington and his company had acted like the lake was simply another feature on a brochure, another marketing tool they could package and sell. Now the man behind the entire project was calling me personally. Not his attorneys. Not a project manager. Not a consultant. Him. "I'm listening," I said. Blake cleared his throat. "I think it would be beneficial for both parties to sit down and discuss an agreement." The funny thing was, he wasn't wrong. Despite what some people in town assumed, I never wanted to destroy the resort. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't looking for a payout big enough to bankrupt anyone. What bothered me was being treated like I didn't exist. If Blake had knocked on my door a year earlier and said, "Mr. Mercer, we'd like to discuss access and water usage," this story probably never would have happened. Instead, they spent millions assuming nobody would notice. A week later we met in person. Blake was younger than I expected, polished, confident, the kind of guy who probably spent more time in boardrooms than forests. But he also looked exhausted. The delayed opening had clearly taken a toll. Investors were asking questions. Guests were canceling reservations. Every week of uncertainty was costing real money. We sat across from each other in a conference room while attorneys reviewed documents. At one point Blake looked at me and said, "You know, we genuinely believed everything was covered." I nodded. "I believe you." He looked surprised by that answer. "You do?" "Sure. I don't think you intentionally ignored it. I think you never thought to look." For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he laughed quietly and shook his head. "Honestly, that's probably true." That conversation changed the entire tone of the negotiation. Instead of fighting, we started solving problems. Rachel helped draft a formal water use agreement. The resort would recognize the protected status of the spring. Any future modifications affecting water flow would require approval. Environmental monitoring would be conducted regularly. Strict usage limits would protect the lake from overdevelopment. Most importantly, the resort would contribute an annual maintenance fund dedicated to preserving the lake and surrounding habitat. The negotiations took several weeks, but eventually both sides signed. The county approved the agreement. The compliance restrictions were lifted, and Cedar Ridge Retreat finally opened its doors. A lot of people expected me to celebrate like I'd won some great battle. The truth was more complicated than that. A few months after opening, I drove past the resort one evening. Families were sitting around fire pits. Kids were roasting marshmallows. Couples walked along the shoreline watching the sunset. The place was busy, successful even. For a moment, I wondered what my grandfather would have thought. Then I remembered something he used to say whenever people got greedy. Success isn't about what you build. It's about what you protect while you're building it. Standing there, I realized the lake had survived because someone decades earlier took the time to protect something most people overlooked. It wasn't the cabins. It wasn't the roads. It wasn't the buildings. It was a small spring hidden in the woods. The source. The thing underneath. Just like Grandpa always said. Over time, Blake and I actually developed a surprisingly respectful relationship. We never became close friends, but we learned something about each other. He learned that old property records matter more than glossy marketing presentations. And I learned that not every developer is a villain. Sometimes they're just people moving too fast to notice what they're standing on. Even today, visitors come to Mercer Lake and admire the scenery. They photograph the water. They rent kayaks. They sit on cabin decks and watch the sunrise. Most of them have absolutely no idea how close the entire project came to falling apart before it ever opened. They don't know there was a moment when 40 finished cabins sat waiting for guests while lawyers and county officials argued over a forgotten document filed decades earlier. They don't know that one small spring nearly stopped a multi-million-dollar business. And honestly, that's probably for the best. But every once in a while, I'll stand on my dock early in the morning, coffee in hand, looking across the water at those cabins. The lake is still quiet. The trees still reflect on the surface. The spring still feeds the water exactly as it always has. And I can't help smiling when I remember how one tiny detail everyone ignored ended up controlling everything. Now I'm curious what you think. Was I right to enforce the water rights even though the resort had already invested millions? Should the developer have been allowed to move forward without restrictions because the project created jobs and tourism? Or was it entirely their responsibility to do proper research before building? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle, and honestly, I can understand both sides of the argument. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates real property disputes, surprising legal twists, and the reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing on a piece of land is the part nobody notices until it's too late.